Our hearts and minds clear? Pray with me. Father God, we come before you today to be in your presence. We come into this place, Father, to be in your presence. And so I pray, Lord, that you would accept our worship as your due when we enter into your presence. I pray, Lord, that you would touch our hearts, that we may be of the right mind and attitude to enter your presence. But most of all, Father, I just pray that you would recognize that we have come to be with you. I know that there are other things that we do this morning, the announcements, the community, the care, and these are important things, Father. But I do ask, Lord, that you would be just open to being with us. Father, as we turn from a time of worship, of praise, and turn into a time of seeing what your scripture, the word that you have left for us, to know you better, I pray, Lord, that you would open our hearts and minds to what you would say to us. I pray, Lord, that you would be present even in this word. And I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Good morning. Is that the third one that you've done this morning, I think? I can't help myself. It's a little bit of a power trip when you get up here and you go, good morning, and everybody has to come back at you. It's a little bit of a power trip. I made good on my promise. I brought my family this week. They are here. My lovely wife, Laura, and then our 3 kids. You will notice that Laura and I have dark hair and dark eyes, and none of our children do. So I promise they're ours. We didn't steal them off the street just to look better. But no, they, somehow all 3 of our children have blonde hair and blue eyes. Meh. Don't know. Both of our fathers have blue eyes, and the blonde hair is a complete mystery. But we're very glad to be with you today, all of us here with you today, and I thank you for the welcome. Thank you for the welcome. The passage of Scripture that I have this morning is my favorite Old Testament book. In the New Testament, I love the book of Ephesians, and I think I talked about that last week. But my favorite Old Testament book is the book of Judges. And the reason is because it counterpoints the book of Ephesians so well. The book of Ephesians is about this elevation of theology, right? It's the one letter that was written that's not a correction of an error in a church. It's the elevation of it. The book of Judges is kind of the opposite of that. The book of Judges is what happens when the church is left to its own devices. And so the Ephesians is this elevation of what happens when we get it right, and Judges is the warning of what happens when we get it wrong. But my favorite story out of the book of Judges, bless you, my favorite story out of the book of Judges is probably my favorite story because I'm really 13 years old and it has poop in it. Yeah, I'm not kidding. I'm 13 and it's my favorite story. This comes from Judges chapter 3. And so I want to read it because the story itself is instructive and it's a very interesting story. But then I want to zoom out and look more at the macro level of what this story is, how it fits into the book of Judges, and how it is instructive in a macro sense to who we are as a church and what we can be and what we can become. Normally when we say that, what we can become, it's hopeful and positive, but we also have to acknowledge that sometimes there's a negative aspect to that. We can become something awful and terrible. And Judges is an examination of that. But we'll start with the micro. We'll start with the story itself. Judges chapter 3, beginning in verse 12. Now, to set the stage, Israel has come out of bondage, out of slavery, out of the nation of Egypt. God worked massive miracles along the way, saved them, provided for them. Manna from heaven, quail, just ankle deep. Water from the rock on 2 different occasions brought them to the promised land. And then there was the era of Joshua and the conquest. And Joshua led the armies of Israel and took over the promised land, a land just overflowing with milk and honey. And they established themselves and they said, okay, we are God's people and we're going to do things differently. We're not going to have a monarchy as every other nation does. We're not going to set ourselves up in governance the way that every other nation does, because we are God's people and He will lead us. And okay, good. And then they all went to their own houses that they had conquered and built and settled. Pushed out the children of Ehud. Not Ehud. The children of Edom that lived there. And Esau, the children of Esau that lived there. And made this God's land. And then there's this repeating pattern that we see in the book of Judges, and it starts here in verse 12. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This is a very common thing. At the start of every narrative of each judge, you get this just little blurb. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and God strengthened X-king. In this case, it is Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Now, this was not an uncommon process back in those days. There were powers that would rise up and then they would fade after some time. But for a while, certain different of these nations that were surrounding Israel, they would gain some technological advantage, or some military commander who was a tactical genius would be born, or some form of advantage would come to this nation, and they would say, you know what? We can have more than we do. And they would go and conquer. It wasn't always to Israel, but it was sometimes to Israel, sometimes to neighboring nations. But Israel was always a prime target for two reasons. One, everybody hated the way that Israel did their nation. They hated this idea that they didn't have a king. They didn't have, this governance the way that everybody else did. There was no one with whom to treat. No one with whom to send messages. They didn't like that. But the other reason was that Israel was in a very profitable region. They had a port area. They also had a major thoroughfare from Egypt all the way up into what we would call modern Russia, into those areas, with the sea on one side and this very mountainous, non-travelable area on the other. Through Israel was really the only thoroughfare to get goods from Egypt in the southern part of the world into the northern part of the world, what was at the time Assyria and other nations. And so Israel began to become fairly wealthy just from tolls, just from these treaties of letting people come through their place and charging them taxes to come through Israel and travel to trade. Of course, that was complicated because there was no king to make the treaty with, which feeds into that first point, right? So these two conflicting points means that Israel, more often than not, is a target for these nations that grow up and become militarily powerful for one reason or another. But here, the author of Judges indicates that the Lord strengthened Eglon. The Lord made it so that Eglon would have the ability to come and conquer Israel. And he gathers to himself some allies who hated Israel anyway, and they went and they conquered and they ruled for 18 years. It's a long time, folks, to be in subjugation. It's a long time to not be free the way that you are supposed to be according to not only your past history, but the very word of your God. It's a long time. Verse 15, then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, a Benjamite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very fat man. So it was very common in those days for left-handed people to train themselves to be right-handed, because left-handed people were seen as a sign of misfortune, a sign of ill will. It was a sign of the devil to be left-handed, which is something that only very recently has kind of been expunged from our society. I didn't realize this until I started doing, work and research into this, but for a lot of years, left-handed people have been shown to be run the gamut from being seen as unlucky to devil-cursed. And so to acknowledge that this man is left-handed is an important point here in Judges. Now, my son is left-handed. The blonde-headed, blue-eyed, left-handed little boy, the walking recessive gene. There's obviously nothing wrong with it, right? But you have to understand the context in those days. Ehud makes for himself this sword. He fashions, it's about a cubit in length. Cubit was about this length. So we're talking 18-ish inches, maybe 15 inches, depending on the individual who's measuring a cubit. And he straps it to his right thigh. Now, because people were so intent on not being left-handed, even left-handed people would strap their weapons to their left thigh, because that's where it was supposed to be. It was unconscionable for someone to strap it to their right thigh, because nobody is that way, right? So you see where this is going, right? He's using his disability to his advantage. He's using the thing that makes him questionable of heritage, the thing that is problematic about him, he's using it to his advantage. Sermon kind of preaches itself, doesn't it? No, I'm going to actually preach it. Thank you for laughing at that. I appreciate that. Those 3 of you that chuckled. Now, Eglon was a very fat man, which makes sense. He was the ruler and had been for 18 years of this incredibly profitable trade route. He was being presented tribute every so often. We don't know if it's an annual tribute or biannual or quadrannual or whatever. But Israel, the entire purpose of Israel during these 18 years was to gather up everything they could and take it to Eglon so that Eglon could be more rich. And what happened to rich people back in those days? It was a sign of wealth to be fat. The fatter you were, the higher your standing in society. So Eglon is just showing himself to be the master of all he surveys. Okay? But this is important. Verse 18, and when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out. Then Ehud went out of the porch and closed the doors of his roof chamber behind him and locked them. Now here's where the 13-year-old boys like me giggle. He stabbed him and he pooped himself. Yeah. But this makes sense, right? Ehud was the man selected by Israel to bring the tribute. So he was obviously the best Israel had to offer, because no one else was worthy of being in the presence of Eglon. No one else was worthy of being in the presence of the king. And of course, the best that Israel has to offer would be the one who would receive this message from God. Remember, back in those days, when nations went to war with each other, it was as much a theological conflict as it was a military or political or geographical conflict. They believed that these nations embodied the God whom they served. And so, of course, it was natural that Ehud, coming into the presence of the king, would have a message from the God that Eglon had conquered. It's easy for us to look at that and go, the reaction was a little extreme from Ehud. Until you realize that what Eglon was doing, that the fact that the Bible records Eglon was fat was blasphemy. Do you see that? He made himself larger on the spoils of God's people. He set himself up over the people of God against the God of Israel and set himself as better than them. So as much as the 13-year-old boy in me wants to giggle, fat man pooped himself, right? Which it is funny, don't get me wrong. This is recorded because it is a theological statement. The man who elevated himself above God was humbled and proved mortal. I work in a funeral home. You know what happens when people pass away? When regular humans pass away? They defecate. That is a natural process. Again, as much as the 13-year-old boy in me wants to laugh at this, and it is funny, don't get me wrong, what this means is that when Eglon tried to set himself up as a god above the God of Israel, Ehud humbled him and proved to the world. He set himself up. He made himself fat on the spoils of the people of God, but when the end came, he was still a mortal man. He was still a mortal man who was humbled as every man is. The fat closed over the blade. He did not pull the sword out, locked the doors behind him, and escaped. Now, here's where the 13-year-old boy in me continues to be amused. When he had gone, the servants came, and they saw the doors of the roof chamber were locked. They thought, surely he's relieving himself in the cool closet of the cool chamber. And they waited until they were embarrassed. But when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there lay their Lord dead on the floor. Now, they were outside the door waiting. How did Ehud get out? Either he walked past them, or, and this is, some theological scholars have made this argument, we know there was a bathroom in there, and what was they didn't have indoor plumbing back then, so what was the bathroom? Just a chute down from the roof. So either Ehud walked past these attendants who were waiting and locked the doors himself, which would have been difficult, or he escaped down the chute and fled. Again, 13-year-old. That amuses me. But the servants, again, this is a theological statement. Don't mistake it. Laugh at it. Juvenile humor, absolutely. But it's still a theological statement. They waited until they were embarrassed. This king who had gotten fat off the spoils of the people of God. Well, he's been in there 45 minutes. Do we wait longer? Do we go check on him? What's happened? You can see this out of a comedy movie in the 90s, right? So they took a key and unlocked the door, and there was their Lord, the one who had set himself up as over the God of the conquered nations. Not only dead on the floor, not dead from anything that was, supernatural, or he didn't ascend somewhere, he didn't elevate to a new plane of existence. He had a sword in his stomach that it was too much work to pull it out because of the vacuum nature of adipose tissue. But not only that, he had soiled himself like any common man. This man who had spent 18 years elevating himself to a position above deity soiled himself like a common man. And so the rest of the story makes sense when you view it in this context. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Serah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. Moab was operating under the assumption that their king could defeat other gods. And when he died a mortal man, as every other mortal man does, their morale was so destroyed that they could not cross over the Jordan again. And this was all done by a left-handed man. A man who was, quote-unquote, disabled. Right? So, I don't think I need to belabor this point. God uses the people that he has despite who they are. I'm living proof of that. For all my flaws and faults as a person, God has used me for over 20 years in the pulpit. Now, you may argue varying levels of efficacy. That was also a joke. Thanks for not laughing and making me feel bad about myself. No, I'm kidding. But God has used me for all my faults and flaws. I'm nowhere near a perfect man, but he has used me all the same. And so the very easy and the very simple and the very true point to take from the story of Ehud and the story of Judges is that God will use anyone so long as they are willing. Flaws notwithstanding, God will use anyone. And I'm proof of that. But there's a larger point to take from this. If you read the other stories of the other judges, you begin to see a pattern. And at first glance, it looks like the book of Judges is a cyclical story. And the pattern goes like this. Israel does what is evil in the sight of the Lord. They fall away from the tenets that Moses laid down. They fall away from how God told them to live. And God gets angry, as he should, as he has a right to, and sends another nation against them. And the nation conquers them because God is angry at them and they no longer have the military prowess that they do when God is blessing them. Because when God blesses Israel, they were one of the greatest military forces the world had ever seen. Not for any technological reason, but because they very often had brilliant military commanders and they very often had the blessing of the Most High upon them. And this was very well known back in those days, that Israel was a tough nut to crack simply because of their God. But time and time again they get tried, and when God is displeased with the behavior of his people, and I phrase that way specifically, because although the ancient nation of Israel is not the church is something different. There are some similarities, and in certain aspects, God behaves the same towards the ancient nation of Israel as he does to the church today. So I want to make that explicit. I am drawing parallels here. You can't always do that with the ancient nation of Israel, but in this case, I believe you can. But when God is displeased with his people and he removes his blessing, and they are no longer following the life he has ordered them to live, you begin to see another pattern within this cyclical pattern. The first pattern is they fall away from the tenets of God. This nation rises up and conquers them. They cry out to God after a certain number of years. They realize they can't do it themselves, and God sends them a hero, sends them what we call a judge. And this judge proceeds to, in some way, and it's always different, but in some way, he alleviates the oppression. Right? He saves Israel from whatever nation God had empowered to teach them a lesson, to put it in overly simplistic terms. And so you see this cycle happen again and again. And these names of these judges, they just fit into that pattern. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah. And then you go on to Gideon and Jephthah and Samson. These judges, they fit into this pattern. But when you read each story and evaluate them individually, you begin to see another pattern. Othniel was the nephew of Caleb, one of the great heroes of the entry into the Promised Land. Caleb was one of the 2 spies who spoke true. And Caleb was preserved during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. He was 40 when they began to wander in the wilderness. He was 80 when they began their conquest of the Promised Land. He was 85 when they finished the conquest of the Promised Land. He said, okay, God has promised me this hill country, and now it's time for me to go take it. You guys can't count on me for anything else. I got to go take my home. And at 85, he led his clan, his family, up mountains to assault the walled cities of giants. And he won. Caleb is a remarkable man that nobody talks about, and I know about it because that's my middle name, so a little bit of a namesake there. I'm very proud of it. But it was just ridiculous, right? His nephew is Othniel. Othniel related to Caleb, this great upstanding war hero, and in that family, he delivers Israel, and he's the first. And then you get Ehud, who is this fine upstanding man, but he's left-handed. A little something. And then Shamgar doesn't get really anything. There's no story there. It just makes note. And then there's Deborah, or Barak, depending on how you identify the judge. Barak, a little bit of a coward. When you read the story of Barak and Deborah, Barak doesn't get the glory that God intended him to have because he was afraid. And so a woman gets the glory. Now, she was a prophetess, so maybe she gets a pass, but back in those days, that was a national shame. Gideon, full-on coward. You read the story of Gideon, that is a lesson in cowardice. This man, he knew what he had to do, and he knew he had to do it, and so he did it at night so nobody would know it was him. He had to be constantly reaffirmed by God, I've got you. Stop worrying about this. The first time we see Gideon, he is threshing grain in a wine press. He's using the wrong equipment because he's so afraid he's going to get caught. He's making life harder on himself. Time and time again, Gideon is a coward. Jephthah sacrifices his own daughter. Child sacrifice. Then we get to Samson. It boggles my mind that we tell the story of Samson to children. Okay? Because if you read the story of Samson, now, the ending, great. He's locked in. He's great, right? Up until then, he sleeps around. He explicitly defies the tenets of his nation. He is a murderer. He's a mass murderer. He is a terrorist. There's a story in the Bible of Samson getting upset at some Philistines, and so he captures a bunch of foxes, ties their tails together with flaming torches, and then turns the foxes loose into grain fields, destroying the livelihood of dozens of farmers, destroying the economy for the region. That is actual, literal terrorism. And yet Samson, we tell this story to children. Why? Are you starting to see the second pattern in the book of Judges? They all do the same thing. Israel sins. God raises up another nation. Israel cries out. God sends them a hero. But the heroes are getting less and less as you go along. Othniel, the perfect hero. Good bloodlines, great track record, impeccable character. And then you got left-handed. A woman. A coward. A man who commits child sacrifice. And an actual terrorist. And so when you read the book of Judges, you see that it's not actually a cyclical book. It is a spiral. It is a spiral down. And my theory is that God raises up the likes of Gideon and Jephthah and Samson because that's the best Israel had to offer at the time. These were the best men that God could find who would do the job he needed done. And this, I think, is the macro point of the book of Judges. When the people of God continually fall away from his tenets, when they continually fall away from what he has told them to do and behaving in the way that he has ordered us to behave, leadership deteriorates. Not because good leaders are hard to find, but because the quality of material with which leaders can be raised up deteriorates as well. This is not a political message. I want to say that right off the top. I'm talking about the church. You draw your own conclusions elsewhere. I'm talking about the church, okay? It's not about the preachers. I don't know. Let me say this. I don't know why this is the message that I have for you today. I don't know you guys. I don't know why I gave you the one last week that I gave you. But here it is. Leadership is a reflection of the quality of those being led. I had a lady tell me, I interviewed at a church several weeks ago, months ago, a couple months ago, wow. And I had a lady call me after the meeting, and she said, I need to tell you something. I said, okay, be glad to talk. And she proceeded to tell me about her divorce. She went through a very messy, difficult, painful divorce. And she began to go to a Christian counselor just to put herself back together. She believed that she needed to be married for her own sake, and she went to a counselor in order to help her kind of organize herself and make sure that she found a good man with whom she could spend the rest of her life. And she spent months in counseling, just discussing what this man would look like, what kind of traits he would have, how she would, go about finding this man. And she said after about 7 or 8 months of kind of discussing this and what she was looking for, what she would need and all of these things, she walked into the counseling one session and sat down, and her counselor looked her straight in the eye and said, okay, now what makes you think you are worthy of this man? She said she had to take a minute. Just, And they spent the next 1.5 years working on her, trying to find the things in her that needed correction, so that when she did find this man that she was looking for, which she did, and they are now happily married, and it's a beautiful story, but that she wouldn't be the one to mess it up. And it's fascinating to me that today's church continually looks for the next Billy Graham, or the next Reese Wall, or the next insert the great pastor from Hopewell's past, and all they find is, well, me. Is it any wonder that anybody's dissatisfied? But if you look at what the church has done over the last 50 years, especially the Quaker Church, which, make no mistake, I am a firm believer in Quaker theology. I love Quaker theology, and I firmly and have studied points to prove why Quaker theology is the answer to today's America. I truly believe that. The problem with the Quaker Church is that we're ready for the 1950s to roll around again. If the 50s roll around, we're primed and ready to go, but 2025, we're not sure about that one, are we? Friends, I don't want this to be accusatory. Please don't hear that. Please hear this as a challenge. We need to be ready. We need to be ready for the next judge. We need to be ready for the next pastor. Because, and here's the hope. Yeah, they had to go through Gideon and Jephthah and Samson, but then they got Samuel. After Samson came Samuel. And after Samuel came Saul. Samuel was a great prophet, but he had some home problems. Saul, for the first part of his tenure as king, was a great king. And then he went off the deep end and he was a problem. But then who came after Saul? David. David. The man after God's own heart. I mean, yeah, they had to go through Jephthah and Gideon and Samson. But then it began to upswing again. Why? Because they worked on themselves. Because the people of Israel under Samuel were called back into being what they were. Now, they made the big mistake of crying out for a king. They got Saul, yeah. But overall, when you look at the life of the people of Israel during that time, instead of falling away again, they came back to God. And they got David. So friends, that is my hope for you, and that is my encouragement to you. You are in a pastoral search period. You may not get your David with the next pastor, but you can take steps in that way. But you got to work on yourselves. You got to be a church that pastors want to come and be a part of. I don't know what that looks like for you. I don't have concrete answers because, again, I don't know you. And that gives me the freedom to say this. I'm so sorry. That gives me the freedom to say this, right? Because there's no baggage with this. But you got to be a church that pastors want to come to. And you do that by being God's people. Be God's people. And you will find your David. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for this day. I thank you for the chance to be in your house, to worship you. I pray, Lord, that you would draw each person in this place closer to yourself. I pray, Father, that you would draw each person in this place deeper into your mysteries, into your person, deeper into who you are, Father. And by drawing us deeper into who you are, you would draw us deeper into who we can become. It is my prayer, Lord, that this church would do the work and that they would find their David. That they would find the one who is to lead them into the next steps, to lead them perhaps into the glory time. Israel had never known a time like the time under David. And I do believe, Father, that if your people will look towards you and work on ourselves, that the best days can be ahead. And I pray that for this church, Father. I pray that you would fall down upon this place and be manifest, be present. Give us, Father, your spirit and your power. You have promised that when we gather together under your name, you would be here. Transform us, Father, into your church, that we may be your people. And I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.